Welcome, classic rock fans, to the 10 albums that built prog. Now, this actually is from an article by Robert Christgau. He actually lists 50 albums that built prog, but I'm not going to regale you with all 50, as that would just be damned inhumane, wouldn't it? So I'd like to go through these albums one by one and arrive at some sort of prog consensus as to how influential were these albums in terms of influencing the prog story, so to speak. Anyway, let's get on with our list. This is the 10 albums. According to Robert Christgau, this is the 10 albums that built progressive rock. The first one, number 10, is The Soft Machine, Volume 2 from 1969. This is an important album. It's an intriguing record. I mean, you've got to remember the Soft Machine recorded their first album, their debut album, in the United States. They were on tour supporting the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Most of the band had jumped ship. I think Kevin Ayers had left. I think it was mainly Robert White who was left in the US, and he was imbibing a lot of this music that was around at the time, namely Frank Zappa and the Mothers for one. And these things had a huge influence on where he wanted to go with the Soft Machine sound. He was sending recordings to the UK to his other Soft Machine members to give a listen to. But this album sees the band exploring a more jazzier sound that is very much instrumental or part of what Soft Machine would pursue later on. Interestingly, of course, this band, uncredited, backed Syd Barrett on his Madcap Laughs album. As I said, Volume 2 was very much inspired by Frank Zappa and the Mothers and centred around two rather lengthy compositions, lengthy pieces. So according to Robert Christgau, this is one of the most important albums in the prog firmament, so to speak. I think it's definitely there, but how influential it was in the actual building of prog is another matter. Number 9 is Fairport Convention's Legion Leaf from 1969. I have no idea why this album is on there. Yes, they were exploring in more extended forms. Electric music meets traditional ballads, I suppose. Electric folk, really. They're seen as a kind of pioneering album in some respects, and a very, very good album as well, don't get me wrong. I just don't see the place. I don't see how this feeds into our prog story, quite frankly. I wouldn't put it on this list at all. Yes, it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting, this whole idea of electric folk, the interpretation of these traditional ballads and songs is done beautifully. But I kind of think Dylan, or certainly the Byrds, were there before Fairport Convention, and the first Simon and Garfunkel album, they employ some traditional songs, I think, on their Wednesday Morning 3am album. And of course, Sound of Silence employs electric guitars and electric instrumentation within the milieu of folk. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I really don't think this album belongs on this list. Number 8 is King Crimson's In the Court of the Crimson King. Now, of course, this album is incredibly important within our any topic or any conversation related to progressive rock. But by the time this album came along, this album was the flag in the sand, as far as I'm concerned, that says this is progressive rock and it's here. I don't really see it as one of the building blocks to prog, so to speak. I don't see it as one of the albums that built prog, other than being fully fledged prog in itself, and I'm probably making no sense whatsoever. Wonderfully important album, probably I think one of the best debut albums ever. Interesting how I read in Steve Hackett's biography, as a young man, he was visiting these early King Crimson gigs, and he was absolutely mesmerised by what they were doing, the sound of that Mellotron, which of course he later bought the fire-damaged Mellotron from Robert Fripp, which Genesis then continued to struggle with for their Nursery Crime and Foxtrot album. Again, as important a progressive rock album as this, as it screams out in those pink and tortured features. As an album that actually built prog, I think we've got to look at the albums that come before this one, quite frankly. Number 7, this one I firmly do agree with, The Thoughts of Emily Stavjak from 1967. This was a fabulous band. Their music now sounds incredibly dated, very twee and psychedelic to a certain extent, but and it's interesting that I think psychedelia in Britain tend to take on this almost faux musical vaudeville pastiche quality, but the Nice didn't. The Nice were very much about blending these classical forms with these long improvisational elements as well. Of course, they were P.P. Arnold's backing band. But I think this is an incredibly important album, incredibly ambitious album. It has a very, very important place in terms of its influence on the burgeoning prog scene. Do check out my videos on the history of progressive rock. There's Volume 1 and Volume 2. You should check them out because they're fabulous. Number 6 is The Days of Future Past by the Moody Blues from 1967. Kind of originally an R&B band that discovered a whole new lease of life when they kind of reneged on their promise to translate Dvorak's New World Symphony, and then kind of went off and did their own thing, really. And also Justin Hayward, the inclusion of Justin Hayward in this band brings an ethereal and spacey quality with him. He's especially blended with Mike Pinder's Mellotron. We can argue about how whether we consider the Moody Blues to be a progressive rock band or not. I certainly think they are an influence, and certainly belong in this list as one of those building blocks that establishes the foundations of progressive rock. There's no doubt the inclusion of Mike Pinder's Mellotron and Justin Hayward's voice pushed this band in a more melodic direction, more ethereal, spacey direction, if you like. Many have seen them as maybe the archetypes of symphonic prog. But interestingly, Stephen Lamb suggests that they are not prog. I shall quote you from his wonderful book. To some progressive rock fans, the grandiose themes and use of the Mellotron make this the first proper progressive rock album. I don't agree. In my opinion, it's a pop rock album with classical trimmings and instrumentation. It is an original and beautifully crafted album, but in our story, it is merely a signpost. I'd love to know whether or not you agree or disagree with that, but I tend to agree with him. I do, however, feel that this album certainly deserves its place as one of the building blocks of the progressive rock movement. Number 5 is Pink Floyd's Piper Against the Dawn from 1967. It's wonderful employment of fairy tale and whimsy and all these myths and archetypes that our Sid delves into, or takes us on this wonderful journey. Of course, inspired by a chapter from the famous Kenneth Grahame novel. We get songs like the very whimsical Bike to the almost proto-prog epics of Astronomy Donomy, which I think is more avant-gardism than it is progressive rock, to be honest with you. Those extended jams and the timing of this album, certainly an influential record. Of course, after Sid leaves, they lose that almost Alice through the looking glass quality and become more spatial as they explore these extended jams or psychedelic noodling. Nevertheless, I think they deserve a place on our list. Number 4 is Procol Harum's debut album from 1967, of course, an album that spawned that iridescent hit, Whiter Shade of Pale, one that's had the beard strokers busy for many a year. Again, I feel about this band in some respects the way I feel about the early Moody Blues albums. I think it's a very important album, an important band on the road to prog, and therefore certainly deserves its place on this list. This album's blend of blues, rock, classical ideas and psychedelia were very much important, very important for our story. However, of course, progressive rock ultimately emerges out of the psychedelic movement as we move towards more avant-gardism and progressive pop, I think, in the UK. Where in the US they seem to go off on a tangent in a slightly different direction. Number 3 is the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band 1967. I think it was Bill Bruford said without this album there wouldn't have been progressive rock. So this is a vital element in our story in terms of how we move towards that sense of layering and texturing, this sheer ambition and scope of what popular music could be. This album very much reinvented musical form in its blending of world music to folk modalities, its psychedelic trippiness and sheer studio ingenuity. This album just exploded, scattering everything with this psychedelic stardust. It's now considered by many to be very much a loose concept album, an idea that certainly appeals to those burgeoning proggers, I guess, but it's a concept that isn't really developed or followed through on. In fact, John Lennon has said he wasn't aware of any concept when he was making the album. It's certainly one that explores themes of childhood, and it also immerses us in this strange and ghostly Victoriana as well. Wonderful, wonderful album that should be on this list. Number 2 is the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds from 1966. 1966 was a wonderful year for music. wonderful. Bob Dylan's Blonde on Blonde, this one, Frank Zappa's and the Mothers, their first album. This remarkable and exquisite record that is imbued with this sense of hymnal wonder. But it's the sheer layering and ambition, this building of all these textures and sounds. It's just a stunning piece of work. Of course, he worked with the wonderful Wrecking Crew. Of course, Brian Wilson, after his meltdown, I think on a flight in the USA, decided he couldn't tour anymore and they wanted to become a studio band or work in the studio. But he was spurred on with this album in terms of the sheer ambition by the Beatles' Rubber Soul. When he heard that, which he thought was a perfect pop album, felt the need to up their ante, really move the Beach Boys away from these songs about girls and cars and surfing, to create this wonderful world of sonic wizardry. But what this album does, and indeed Sgt. Pepper, is tell people that the studio is very much part of the creative process and that there are no boundaries to what you can achieve with music. So here we are, number one, the Grand Fromage in our prog story, which according to Robert Christgau is the most important album in terms of the signposting of progressive rock. And that is the Mothers of Invention and Freak Out from 1966. This is a hugely influential and important album as well. Before prog rock, you had almost shock rock, if you like, with Frank Zappa and the Mothers, this very avant-garde experimentation. This collaboration of these mothers, these best musicians, to produce this wonderful record, which I think was released in the UK as a single album. Not only kickstarted Zappa's career, it also hinted at where psychedelic sounds might be heading. Though Zappa in large was very much about parodying or poking fun at the subculture, really, which he viewed with a fair degree of suspicion. So there we go, a rather interesting walk through Robert Christgau's 10 albums that built progressive rock. How much do we agree with it, or not? And this is a bit of an aside, of course, but I had a fascinating conversation with a friend of mine the other night, and he insists that Hawkwind belong on this list as one of the bands that built prog. I fundamentally disagreed. I said, well, when Hawkwind started, they were known as the Famous Cure, and then I think they became Project X, and then Hawkwind Zoo. I think it was John Peel that actually suggested to them that they drop the Zoo bit of their name. But for me, they didn't really become Hawkwind proper until people like Barney Bubbles, Robert Calvert, Michael Moorcock all boarded the ship. And that must have been about 70, 71. I could be wrong here anyway, but I don't think Hawkwind deserve a place in this particular story. Tell me if you think I'm wrong and why. I'd love to hear from you. So please leave your comments below in terms of whether you agree with this list or not. And if you just can't get enough of prog and the prog story, check out this video up here. Anyway, I will end as I always do by thanking you all for watching and urging you to click like, subscribe, and do check that bell so you get notified of any future uploads and videos, and check some of the links below this video. Become a Patreon, why not? There's loads of stuff on my Patreon, plus monthly Zoom calls and all sorts of things, shenanigans going on there. Anyway, I shall leave you with my closing salvo, which is, as you know, I hope you're all staying safe and well, and more importantly, that you keep listening.